Hey folks, in today's video we're covering the latest Tinto Talks for Project Caesar aka EU5, and this week Johan's going to be talking to us about logistics and how sieging is going to work. Overall, I think this is a pretty good dev diary. I like most of the changes I see here. As always, if you enjoy the video, please do hit that like button. It helps other people find the channel. But let's just get straight into the dev diary. The first thing he's got to cover is leader assignment. So what they're changing in EU5 is that once you have a character assigned to lead an army or a navy, you can't then remove him for 12 months after you have done that. So this does remove, as he says here, the teleporter leader around the world exploit, and also makes a much more interesting choice on how you deploy your characters. I think this is a great change because it was a bit cheesy that you could have one army, say, fight in North America and then just teleport that general to a different army that was going to fight in Asia or somewhere, and there was no like time delay or anything like that. You could just teleport him around, as Johan points out here. So I think this is a pretty good change, especially with how characters are going to work in the game. I think it does make sense that they are at least semi-locked to an army or a navy. Now, one thing I will say is that the navy, Johan does say at the end, is going to be covered in next week's dev diary. So we're going to finally get some information on how the navy works. Looking forward to that one already. The next section is going to talk about reinforcing regiments. We've had this discussed previously. I think it was in the last two dev diaries. He did say it was changing, but we're finally getting some information on it. While your levies cannot be reinforced, that was covered in a previous dev diary, your regular regiments will attempt to reinforce if you still have manpower and get access to the goods they require. Again, certain units require certain materials to function properly. A regiment that is part of an army that is retreating, is in combat, loaded on a ship, or currently taking attrition will not be able to reinforce. So I don't think that's much of a change from EU4, if I remember correctly. I think that was the case anyway. A regiment can only be reinforced in your own locations and in a location owned by somebody you are fighting a war together with when the location is not currently occupied. And the first UI we've got here is the regiment screen, I believe, and this is showing the current strength is 84, the maximum strength is 100, and it will reinforce by 5 people per month. The reinforcement speed in the location the army is currently, I believe, is the base of 5%. It also has access to goods that it requires, so it's times by 1. So I guess that means it is just 5% in this case. So just a small example there. That looks like an army from very early in the game, one of the regiments whilst you still have levies. The next section is army movement. Again, some big changes here to EU4. When people talk about logistics, it is usually intrinsically linked to the movement of armies, and the movement of armies in Project Caesar has some change in it compared to what you're used to, as I was just saying. One of the things they've taken inspiration from is Hearts of Iron. Now, I'm going to be honest, I've not played Hearts of Iron. It is kind of lore, I guess, on the channel that I've never really played it. I keep saying I'm going to play it at some point. I've just never got around to it. Do let me know in the comments down below if this does sound like it is like Hearts of Iron. I'm used to Crusader Kings and EU4 and Imperator Rome, basically all the other Paradox games. I've just never played Hearts of Iron, really. And the inspiration from that series is that the armies, while moving, will take some morale hits. This creates a natural flow of armies marching and then resting, and not just marching across Europe, immediately joining a battle like a march has no impact at all. This is a fantastic change. As he points out here, this is going to stop you just randomly moving your armies all around the map constantly. As we saw last week, it's going to kind of curtail doom stacking as well. Is it going to be too micromanagey? I'll let you decide by the end of this dev diary. There's far more micromanagement coming along. They've also added the fact that an army that is beyond a certain size will be marching slower, and the size is based on the total frontage that it is fielding. So your armies that are bigger are actually going to move slower than more nimble armies. That does make sense, I think. While you can attach units to other units, this makes the attached units move slower, as military organization in the late medieval era was rather limited. In later ages, you will get advances that reduce the penalty significantly, completely limiting it in the Age of Revolutions. And speaking particularly about that age, they have an advance that makes multiple corps combat more interesting, making them march to the sound of the guns. This advance allows an army to automatically react if another army of yours is in combat adjacent to this one, and it will quickly march to join the battle. So it sounds like this is semi-automated. So if you have an army in one province fighting another one, and then you have another army next to it, the army next to it will automatically try and join that battle by the sounds of it. From how that is worded anyway, that's what I'm taking it as. I think that's pretty good. I guess you can probably turn this off as well. Well, to be honest, you just don't pick up the advance, and then you wouldn't get it anyway. But I guess you can turn it off once you pick the advance up. And speaking of the advances, he's actually going to show off here a few of the Age of Revolution advances. You can see on the right-hand side at the bottom the march of the sound of the guns that he was just talking about. But you've got heavy frigates, conscription centres, and then you've got the best one, Napoleonic warfare, ignore zone of control. Again, this was mentioned, I think, in the initial warfare dev diary, where there is going to be zone of control, very much like EU4. He is going to cover that in a second as well. It's going to work a lot more like Imperator Rome, which is fantastic. But once you pick up this advantage, you can ignore zone of control from forts entirely. So I think this does mean maybe people will stick around into the endgame a little bit more. I think people do enjoy having forts being a little less powerful, and that does make sense as the technology and eras progress. They got less and less useful. Armies could generally just kind of ignore them. You know what I mean. The next section is going to be food and armies. This is a massive change, and this is one that's going to be a little bit contentious, I think, as to whether people are going to enjoy it or not. And that is that each army will now have food that it consumes each month, else they start deserting and dying. So if you don't feed them properly, they will kind of attrition themselves to death in a way. If you do run out of food during a siege, you are basically forced to abandon the siege very quickly as your army evaporates. This was hinted at last week, that sieges were going to be more difficult and you weren't always going to be guaranteed to win them as an attacker. And this is one of the ways it is going to make it a lot more difficult for you to do so. So if you don't supply your army that is sieging somewhere down, if they run out of food, that siege is probably going to fail unless you're very, very lucky. Obviously, you can curtail that. You can actually feed your people, and that is what's going to be covered in a second. So a standard infantry regiment will carry a few months of supplies with them, but once they are gone, they are gone. With this, they needed a new unit, and that is the auxiliary category of logistic units that can carry much more food than any other type of unit. This is like the baggage trains of, armies of yesteryear, and they're going to feed your army as you progress around the map. So camp followers, a unit type here, is the auxiliaries, as they were just saying. Requirements for construction, metalworks, leather, copper and tin. Requirements for maintenance, paper, medicine, metalwork, and leather. This costs 1 manpower a month by the looks of it. And then the unit statistics, as you can see, terrible at fighting. In fact, awful at fighting. But it does have that 6 food storage and pretty good movement speed as well. So you can probably bring this around in other minor armies maybe to kind of shuttle food between your different armies. I think this is going to make combat so interesting. It's not going to be like EU4 where you can just move your armies around, as we were saying, and just siege down whoever you want, fight whoever you want. You are actually going to have to think about the logistics of how you're going to feed these armies, where are they going, how fast can they get there, how big are the stacks of those units, all those kind of things. It does sound like combat's going to be a lot more interesting. So with all that, how do you actually get food to your armies outside of the actual units themselves there that can stock them? Well, if you have them stationed in your own locations, they will take food from the local provincial supplies. So you sometimes have to be careful about where you station your armies, so not to cause local population to starve. So that is, again, another layer of this. If you have your armies just stood around in the wrong location, they're actually going to be taking the food from the local populace. They're going to be dying off, potentially, if they're not getting fed properly, but your army is kind of taking all that food for themselves. So you are going to have to be careful about where you place your army in your realm, even during peacetime. If you want to get your food from your allies or other countries you have military access with, you need to negotiate a treaty that allows you to take their food supplies. This is on top of the military access as well. This is not something that every country will be willing to accept. Your subjects have no say in this. Most type of subjects will give this implicitly. So if you have somebody as a vassal or something, they can't say no. So I guess you could kind of station your army in your vassal's land permanently and just kind of ruin them. I guess they're not going to be happy about it, but that is one way you could work around this a little bit, I guess. You could almost have like a breadbasket vassal that you use to station your armies in. But reading through that, that's, again, another bit you're having to think about. You've got the military access, and then if you can get the right kind of treaty with them, you can actually feed your army as they're moving through their lands as well. It's going to be interesting exactly where that's going to be useful around the map. In Europe, especially around the HRE and things, it's going to be a little bit fiddly, I would imagine, but especially later game where the nations are bigger, that would be pretty useful, I would think. A lot more use out of it anyway. Not quite as many contracts needed. And then in the next screenshot, this is showing off the food capacity of one of these armies. So you can see the current food, the monthly change, the maximum capacity, the monthly consumption that they have at the moment. And as you can see, each type of unit is split out. So I believe some of them will have different rates of consumption. Funnily enough, the ones that are shown are actually exactly the same, 0.10 across the board here. Impact on current attrition. I would imagine if you don't have enough food, that is where the attrition is going to go up. And then food access is armies in Tanna, where they have control of the food supply. Province food supply plus 1.33. So if this army was in somewhere where you didn't have supply, I guess that would show 0. Or if you're in somewhere that doesn't really have much supply, it's going to show you a much lower number. and then that will affect the monthly change, obviously above if it isn't at maximum capacity. And then further information on the food supply. So when you are at war, you can steal food from occupied provinces. If you control the capital of a province, you can steal the food from the local populace that then can be used to feed your armies. So this is how you can, I guess, feed it a little bit. If you do occupy provinces, you can steal some food from that land as well. If your army is in a hostile location where they cannot get local food, you can try trace access up to 2 locations away through controlled locations to get food. If you can't reach your own locations at this distance, there are 2 ways to get food to your armies. So this is how I think they're going to prevent you really kind of diving into a capital and somewhere. Very much like most Paradox games now, this is really going to guide you to take over the border provinces and then move in like the next level of border provinces and again until you get to where you're trying to go to, if it isn't on the border itself. Because with these limitations, you're not going to be able to dive all the way into like a capital of a realm if it's really far in their land, because you're going to have no food supply and you're just going to get wiped out pretty much by the sounds of it. They're just going to whittle away and there's going to be nobody left once you reach the location you're getting to. And with the siege changes we've already seen, and there's going to be more covered later on, you're not going to be guaranteed to win these sieges like you are in EU4. So it is going to make you think about this. So what are these 2 ways? Well, the first one is you can build supply depots. These allow you to store food in a location, and then that location acts, well, as a depot. So you place it in one place, and then your army, if it is in range, will take food from that location. Now, the cool thing is that you can actually use another army. So maybe one of these that are filled with those caravans from earlier, and you can actually resupply that depot. So you can place it somewhere, especially if you think you're going to have a long drawn-out war, and then you can have your army fighting, and then like a secondary army that is like doing shuttle runs to kind of fill this supply depot up so that your advancing army has use of it for longer and longer. So again, that's kind of like, I guess, a little bit micromanagey. I do wonder how much you can automate that. Maybe you can have an army set to automation, as they did cover last week, and all that does is shuttle supplies between these supply depots, because that will get rid of something that you're not probably that interested in, but you do have to be doing to be successful in these new wars. The second way to do it outside of that is your navies. There are 2 unit abilities that can be done for them: gathering food and distributing food. Gathering food will take food from any adjacent province you own, and your fleet can store food depending on the food carrying capacity of its ships. Distributing food allows the navy to act like a floating supply depot, and that your armies can get food from them. So with this, there's 2 ways. There's the land way, and there's also these supply fleet ways as well, which is great, especially if you're island hopping, doing wars. While we do understand that not every player will enjoy this much logistics, for those of you, you can assign logistic objectives to your supporting armies and navies, and then they will solve it for your main armies. Well, there you go. That's what I was just saying. Hopefully you could do this, and it does sound like that is the case. So you can set your armies to just be logistical armies. I wonder if there's a perfect setup for your general, maybe high diplomacy or something that was covered last week, where they're going to be fast, but they're going to bring a lot of food at the same time. You don't care if they're that good at fighting. They're just going to be bringing food to your actual fighting army. To me, this all sounds fantastic. I think it makes war a lot more interesting. I'm sure some of you probably not so much. You'll have to let me know in the comments down below how you're feeling about this so far. And if none of those work for you, there is one final way to supply your army, and that is defeating other armies. If you defeat them and they have any food left, you actually steal that. I wonder if there's going to be certain cultures, certain traits or something like that that make you especially good at that. I would think that would be the case. And with all that, that is the logistics side of this dev diary. As I was just saying, let me know what you think in the comments down below. It is a step up, I think, in complexity from EU4, but I don't think it's too crazy. We'll have to see how this automation works. But if you are wanting to get in there, really micromanage everything, really min-max everything as well, you're going to have a lot of fun by the sounds of it. And then the second half of the dev diary, this is all about sieges and occupations. This is where there has been some changes. There's also been one thing that hasn't changed, and we'll get to that at the end. One thing that I think probably should have changed and hasn't. But anyway, let's get into it. So this is how sieges are going to work. First of all, there are 2 different types to talk about here, and not all locations are equal. Locations without any fortifications will not have a long siege, and an army with a full-strength regiment is enough to take this in a few weeks. A location with some sort of fortification requires a full siege. So as you can see from here, this is a siege. Obviously, the next phase will start in 18 days. Siege phases are 19 days long due to the base amount, which is 30 days, defensive impact of the actual place you're doing, your offensive societal value. Again, we haven't got much information about societal values, but Johan did call out that offensive here is talking about the societal value, so we will see about what they actually do in the future. But it looks like if you do have a more offensive structure to your nation, you are going to be able to siege quicker. Again, that does make sense. Fort maintenance, I'm not sure why that affects it. Oh, I guess if they don't have their fort fully maintenance, it makes it quicker. Average literacy of clerics, sure. Offensive impacts of the Teutonic Order, army tradition, and the offensive modifier again affecting it here as well. So it looks like the offensive societal value is actually having 2 impacts here, which is pretty interesting. And that is how sieges are going to look whilst you're playing the game. As they were mentioning earlier, food has a significant impact on how you plan your military campaigns, as it affects how long you can sustain a siege. The big thing here, and this is the major change, is that sieges are gambles. You aren't guaranteed to win a siege. We were talking about this in last week's Dev Diary, where you could always win a siege. As long as you have enough people, you could pretty much never lose it. It just depended on how long it took you. Whereas now it is going to be the case where these are even more of a dice roll, if you want to think about it, depending on how well you keep your army maintained. With these changes, you won't know when a fort will fall, and now the fact that you can run out of food will also be an additional risk towards losing or failing in a siege. About every 30 days, there's a chance for something to happen in a siege, with chances of it getting worse for defenders or holding out for another month. Now, this is a thing that I'm surprised hasn't changed, and I'm sure some people will have some feedback on this, is that we're kind of still getting the EU4 siege system, and I'm very surprised this is the case. With everything else that's changed with some systems in the game, I kind of presumed this was going to change, but it isn't. As you can see from this screenshot, it's pretty much the same as it is now. Yes, it's slightly different. There are more outcomes than there are currently, but it is just a dice roll that gets steadily better and better and better for you as the siege progresses. Again, I'm kind of surprised. I thought we'd get a rework of this in some way, but I suppose it kind of does work, and with the other changes that we've got, it does make sieges a lot more interesting than just sitting looking at that percentage, hoping that it's going to get to a decent amount, while the AI gets 2% and wins that roll immediately. But yeah, let me know what you think. I'm kind of surprised this hasn't changed, but there we go. With these changes, the assault is now a more potentially viable option, as you either win and save food and time, or you fail the assault and have taken casualties and thus preserve your food supply longer. I guess that is one way to look at it, I suppose. So here's saying you can rush these sieges. In EU4, you especially do this when you're way outscaling the forts and you don't really care if you lose troops. Just, yeah, whatever. Just assault it down as quick as possible. I'm going to take more losses, but I don't really care about it. Johan here actually pointing out, well, you could do this, and yes, you would have less people, but then they would need less food, and then the actual siege could potentially survive longer. So I guess that is a funny way to look at it. While besieging a coastal location, it is not only important to blockade it to make the siege faster, it can also at the same time supply your army with food. So with the changes mentioned earlier, this is a good point. You can now actually blockade a port, and if you're also sieging it, they're not going to be able to get food from anywhere. Whereas if you don't have a fleet, they can obviously just bring ships into the port and resupply the fort so they won't run out of food. Again, another layer here, and making fleets that bit more important, because I don't believe it works like that in EU4. I can't remember if blockading armies affects sieges on coastal cities. Again, somebody let me know in the comments down below. I can't remember though off the top of my head. The next thing we're going to talk about is automatic control. This is something that's come over from Imperator Rome. This is fantastic, this change. I'm really happy that they've done it, so let's just get straight into it. As the map is more granular than previous games, warfare would turn into a massive slog to manually siege or occupy every single location. Now, while we have more automation systems in EU5, it would still not be very fun. So they did cover this last week. You can set armies to just carpet siege, so it's kind of automated, and they would do this over time anyway. In Project Caesar, though, there are 2 ways to automatically gain control over several locations at once. First of all, if you take a fort, all locations in its zone of control will start changing control to you. If you haven't played Imperator Rome, this is how it works. You take the fort, and then any land it was defending just switched over to you over time. I don't think it was instantaneously, but it was pretty quick if it wasn't. And then that allowed you to just move on and do more warfare elsewhere. And then on top of that, secondly, if you take the capital, you will start getting control over all locations in that province. Of course, this is blocked by hostile armies and forts. So yes, if you take one of these control areas and then another army is there or another fort is there, they obviously prevent you flipping it over to your side. But obviously, once those armies move, that will no longer be the case. As mentioned in previous dev diaries, they do have the zone of control system in Project Caesar, but this one uses the far less complicated rules that were used in Imperator Rome. As you might have noticed earlier, there is an advance in the Age of Revolutions that allows you to ignore zone of control. We covered that earlier, and that was covered in one of the very early dev diaries. While they may be useful to chase down enemy armies, you often want to take forts and cities anyway to get your logistics sorted out. So obviously, if you take that land, if you take all that province by flipping a capital of a province or a fort, that allows you to then bring your supplies through that captured territory as well. It has a double benefit. You're taking that land, you're getting more war score, and then you're also able to bring your logistics to feed your armies. And then the last thing they're going to cover here is recruitment options of your actual armies. One thing that has not been mentioned yet is how this works, and there are different recruitment methods for different regiments, where you can either rush the training so that the regiment can be ready earlier but will be far less effective, or you can spend more time in training and they will start with higher experience. So you can be quick, less experience, but you have that unit if you're fighting a defensive war probably and you're just desperate for some troops, or if you're planning for a future war, or maybe if you even just have some regiments in the back of your empire somewhere, you can spend time training them up and then bring them into the war later on. So again, both ways you can do this, and as you can see in the UI here, recruitment time plus 50%, starting experience 20, and they're going to have more experience, but they will obviously cost you more because they're going to be in training for that bit longer as well. But with all of that, that is the dev diary for this week, covering logistics and sieges. Overall, as I said at the beginning, I'm really on board with most of these changes. It's going to make warfare so much more interesting, I think, than it is in EU4, where it's just build a doom stack, rampage across Europe or something, all having a good time, and it's very hard to lose once you get experience with the system. In this one, you're going to have to think about where your armies are moving, how fast they're going to move, how supplied they are, which forts you want to take, all of these different things, what kind of treaties you've got with people. That's going to help you with future warfare and all of those kind of things as well. So overall, I like it. As I said, I'm kind of surprised the siege system stayed relatively intact, but with all the other changes, I'm sure it will play out quite differently during your campaigns. But with all that being said, next week we're going to get information about ships and the naval aspect of the game. We've had hints here or there about how this is going to work. Obviously this week, some information about how blockades work and things like that, but we're going to get our first information on navies next week, so I'm looking forward to that. But as always, if you have enjoyed the video today, hit that like button, subscribe if you are new here. I'm covering EU5 up to official announcement, launch and beyond, and I also cover Crusader Kings 3 in a very similar way if you are interested in that game as well. But we'll leave it there, and I'll see you in the next one.